What's up everybody? It's Greg Peters with the Car Passion channel here, and in today's video, we're gonna talk about CHUBS. This is a stock Miata tire. It's 195 millimeters wide, and it's capable of providing some of the best driving experiences one could ever imagine. But one might think to themselves at that point, what if I installed a wider tire on my Mazda Miata? Maybe just a 205, or maybe a 225. But what if I could fit a 245? What if I could eliminate the rain grooves to get more rubber on the ground? What if I could get a tire that uses a rubber 4 times stickier than stock, and then I could optimize my alignment to get even more of that tire on the road surface? What a cornering monster it could become. And then maybe after a few years and a couple different wheel and tire setups, you end up with something like this. This is a 245/40 R compound 100 treadwear dry condition only pretty much tire. And that, my friends, can generate a crazy amount of grip. Multiply the difference between those two tires by 4. And for a 2,300 pound car, that's an insane amount of rubber. Now, some of you may be familiar with a dude called Isaac Newton. Okay, he's not just a dude, he's a mathematician, physicist, etc., but that's beside the point. Anyways, Newton's got some laws, and one of his laws states that an object in motion will stay in motion at a constant speed in a straight line unless it's acted upon by an unbalanced force. So picture the Miata is that object. You're driving down the road in a straight line and you turn the steering wheel. That object changes direction. Now, picture that same scenario. You're driving the Miata down the road, but you got your big sticky tires on, you turn the wheel, and your Miata can actually change directions much faster now. But it takes a lot more force to get the Miata to change direction. That brings me to the topic of today's video. That force has to be transferred through the sidewalls of the tires, the wheels, and you may have guessed by now, the hubs. And that's the reason why when you install a stickier tire on your Miata, especially if you're driving it hard, it puts more force into those hubs. It puts more stress on the hubs. But why is that a bad thing? So this is a stock hub, and it's a well-engineered piece of equipment that's perfectly suited to run the stock tire setup. But with over 30 years of fatigue under its belt and big sticky tires, especially if you're taking your Miata to the track, this can happen. Now, hub failures are scary. I've not personally had a hub fail, luckily, but failures do happen and it can be a very dangerous situation. But this is where SuperMiata comes in.
These are the brand new SuperMiata competition hubs, or CHUBS for short. Full disclaimer, 949 Racing did send me these hubs to review, so huge shout out to them for allowing me to showcase this beautiful product. But beautiful is an opinion, and I don't expect you guys to want these hubs based on my opinion, so before I get to installing these on my Miata, let's take a look at some Snapple facts. My stock front hubs are around 5 millimeters thick, depending on where you measure, and have also been through 32 years of weather and abuse. The SuperMiata front hubs come in at 11 millimeters thick, which is over double. The stock rear hubs are about 8 to 9 millimeters thick, where the CHUBS come in at 12 millimeters. Now, thicker hub flanges mean not only significantly reduced chance of failure, but also better steering response, better alignment maintenance during hard cornering, and reduced brake pad knockback, which is where the hub flex allows the rotors to push the pads slightly into the calipers during cornering and makes the brake bite point inconsistent. And the more grip your car has, the greater these benefits become. For the fronts, wheel bearings come pre-installed, and these are higher than OEM quality for less rolling resistance and increased durability, and new axle nuts are also included. New OEM studs are included as well with all 4 hubs, but as an option, you can order them with SuperMiata extended studs pre-installed, which are shown here. Not only are they stronger than stock, but they're also great if you need to run a small spacer to tune in your wheel fitment, and they also make it easy to quickly install wheels at the track and reduce the chance of cross-threading your lug nuts due to their rounded ends and further protrusion through the wheel. They also include ABS tone rings, which means they are ABS compatible, unlike some other hubs on the market, And don't worry, they still fit non-ABS cars like mine just the same.
Now, the addition of ABS rings is a pretty cool perk for me because my car does not have ABS. So now I can add those ABS rings in the front, add a vehicle speed sensor to one of those rings, and now I have front wheel speed and rear wheel speed, which I can link up to the ECU and add traction control, which I was strongly against in the beginning, but I'm realizing more and more that for my car, it could be a pretty good performance benefit. Boost by gear is not like a one-size-fits-all tuning strategy all the time because the road surface can be vastly different, the tire temperature can affect traction, and those issues are compounded greatly the more and more power the car has. So the Miata has enough power sometimes to spin fourth, and when it spins, sometimes it spins really bad. Like it just zips up to redline and the car doesn't accelerate. So with traction control, my hope is that it will be able to catch that slip early and keep the whole situation a little bit more under control. Now, I already got an ABS sensor so I can get that all hooked up, but I'm not gonna do that in this video because I think it's gonna be quite an undertaking with the wiring and getting hooked up to the ECU and tuning and all that. So we'll do a deep dive on that in a later video, but got the stuff ready for it, so I think that's gonna be a fun one too. So with all these features and a complete package of hubs from SuperMiata, the elephant in the room, of course, is the price. So you can get all 4 hubs, that's a set for the front and the rear, with the SuperMiata extended studs pre-installed for $548. That's as of the filming of this video. And if you think that's expensive, you've never shopped for aftermarket hubs before, because if you go looking for a set of billet hubs from any other source, you're looking at double or even triple what you're paying for a set of the SuperMiata hubs. And yes, of course, the billet hubs are gonna have some advantages. They're probably a little stiffer, they're probably a little stronger, but in my opinion, the SuperMiata hubs really do a good job of bridging the gap between the weak stock hubs and what for most people I think would be complete overkill. Now, of course, that's just my opinion, and I invite you to do all of your research and look up every hub you can if you're shopping for aftermarket hubs for your car, but in my opinion, these things are the best bang for your buck. Plus, 949 Racing has been developing track-purposed Miatas for so many years that if these get their seal of approval, they're definitely good enough for my Miata, and they're probably good enough for yours too. Anyways, enough talking, let's get on to the install.
Alright, so per usual here on the Car Passion channel, I'm going to show you how to install both the front and rear hub upgrades at home with essentially the least amount of tools possible to make it accessible to the largest number of people. That being said, for the rear hubs specifically, I do highly recommend bringing them into a shop and having the new bearings pressed in and having the hubs pressed into the bearings. It'll probably cost you maybe 50 bucks and save you a bit of a headache. Anyways, I think I found my hammer, so let's get these babies busted out in the driveway. Starting with the rear, before you jack the car up, you want to loosen the axle nut, and if it's the first time it's ever been removed, you probably want a breaker bar bigger than the ego of the average 1.6 owner. Now's a good time to crack the lug nuts loose as well. Once it's up in the air and securely on a jack stand, you can remove the wheel and then remove the brake caliper by loosening the 2 14mm bolts on the back that are quite tricky to film, but there's not much going on back there, so I promise you'll find them. Before the caliper is ready to drop, go ahead and place a full box of Rapid Set stucco patch down. This can be found at Home Depot, aisle 24, bay 3, and is around $21. Anyways, once the bolts are removed, place your caliper on top of that box, and at this point you can remove the brake rotor as well. This is also a great time to change the brake pads if needed. Now just remove the axle nut, and if you've never pulled your axle before, this can be tough. I always get accused of making jobs look a little too easy, so here's your warning. If the axle is stuck in the hub, you can just skip this step and hope that slide hammer puts in work, since it can pull the hub out of the bearing and off of the axle at the same time with enough force. Now, while I actuate this slide hammer, I'd like to slide in a quick moment of appreciation for all the Car Passion channel's patrons. You guys are on screen right now, and I am so grateful for your support each month to the channel. It really helps me make more videos just like this one. If you're interested in joining, details to that can be found down in the description of this video, as well as many other resources. Now, back to the chubs. And the slide hammer strikes again. These are available for free rental from stores like AutoZone and O'Reilly Auto Parts. Now, oftentimes what will happen is the wheel bearing will break in half when you pull the hub, so plan on buying new OEM rear wheel bearings and hub seals prior to doing this job. Next, remove the rear upright by loosening 2 bolts, one top and one bottom. Be careful when you pull the bottom bolt out because this thing is still a little heavy even with the hub removed. You'll need snap ring pliers to remove the snap ring from the wheel bearing, and don't forget to remove that before attacking the bearing itself. Okay, now if you don't have access to a press, it's time to put in some work. Support the hub with some 2x4s, and you want to position them so that the force of hammering isn't going into the dust shield, kind of like this. Then grab the biggest socket that you have that will fit into the bore, preferably one you don't care about beating up a little bit, and go to town. Please wear safety glasses when smashing metal things together as well. Here you can see the bearing is almost out, and if you smack this thing hard enough, the balls will fly out like Sonic's rings, and you'll have yourself some new slingshot ammunition.
Hey, Car Passion, Greg here, and welcome to the science portion of today's episode. Now, I caught a little bit of flack in my old video, how to replace your rear wheel bearing without a press, during the reassembly process, where I may have been a little hard on that new bearing going in and the hub itself going into it. And a common suggestion was to freeze the bearing, heat up the hub, etc. And I will be freezing and heating up certain parts today in hopes that they go together a little bit easier, but I've always been curious. How much does freezing or heating a part actually change its size? So I'm going to compare how much the bearing shrinks in the freezer, how much the hub grows, that inner bore. And I know it's not gonna be by very much, so it's gonna take some precision tools to measure that, like engine building tools, which I have an entire suite of, so this will be pretty sweet.
Alright, I'll zoom through this as quick as possible, but there's gotta be at least one other nerd out there that finds this stuff as interesting as I do. If that's not you, you can check out the segmented time bar below and skip ahead to the rest of the install. Also, I'm gonna be speaking in bald eagles here since that pertains to the majority of my audience, but metric measurements will be on screen as well. So there are two tight fitments that we're dealing with here. The bearing going into the knuckle and the hub going into the bearing. I'm gonna measure everything out at room temperature to see how tight they normally fit, then freeze and heat certain parts to see how that tolerance changes. First, I want to compare the outer diameter of the bearing versus the inner diameter of the knuckle using a micrometer and bore gauge. So the bearing is 14 10,000ths of an inch larger than the knuckle. This is what's known as an interference fit, where the thing going in is bigger than the thing it's going into. And if you're headed to the comments section immediately after hearing that, you better just scroll back up to the video right now and not type out the joke you just thought of. Anyways, that is the reason the bearing is so hard to get in. It's exactly this much larger than the bore in the knuckle, and hopefully freezing it will change that. Next up, I'll measure the hub versus the bearing's inner diameter, and we have another interference fit, although it's not quite as tight as the other one, being a difference of just 10 10,000ths of an inch. But the hub is still larger than the bearing, so it's going to be a very tight fit. So here we have a very frozen bearing, as you can see through the FLIR thermal imaging camera. I freaking love this thing. I have it linked in the description for anyone who wants to check it out. I come up with new experiments to do with it all the time. Anyways, the bearing came out roughly 15 10,000ths of an inch smaller than when it was at room temperature, which is a great start. That means it's nearly the same size as the diameter of the knuckle. But I'm not done yet. I still need to see how much I can expand that bore with heat. So in an attempt to get the most accurate measurement possible, assuming that the bore might not be perfectly uniform and differences in measurements could be attributed to taking said measurement in a different part of the bore, I set up my bore gauge in a fixed position, heated the knuckle, and then filmed the gauge to see how much I could get the needle to move. I got the hub just north of 200 degrees Fahrenheit and watched and waited. So this is a couple minutes of footage sped up, but you can clearly see the needle moves as the knuckle shrinks back down. It moved about 1 tick, which is equal to 10 10,000ths of an inch. So now, with the difference in temperatures, the bore is actually larger than the bearing, which theoretically means I might be able to just drop the bearing in with zero effort. Now that absolutely did not happen. I want to be very clear, and although it did take some effort to get this in, I'm just gonna tell myself that it would have been harder if I hadn't introduced the bearing to my frozen chicken tendies. I'm thinking that the parts probably start equalizing in temperature as soon as they contact each other and become an interference fit once again quite rapidly. Maybe I'll try dry ice next time. Anyways, make sure you use the old bearing as a tool to hammer in the new one. You only want to be impacting the outer race. If you hammer the inner race, you can damage the bearing. Now I tried the same experiment comparing the hub outer diameter versus the bearing inner diameter at room temperature, and they are also an interference fit by 10 10,000ths of an inch. I didn't want to heat up the bearing since it has rubber seals in it, but I did freeze the hub to see how much it would shrink, and this nearly brought it down to the same diameter as the bearing, remaining an interference fit, but just by the smallest possible amount. Now, after greasing the inner race of the bearing and crossing my fingers, it didn't really help as much as I was hoping. But this part is really important. If you're going to drive the hub on like this, you need to support the inner race from the bottom side so that you're not putting excessive axial force into that bearing that it's not designed to support. So find a socket, brace it against the ground or workbench, and make sure it stays in place. Drive it home until it sits flat, and you're good to go. And don't worry, the front hubs are way easier to install. I just wanted to get the hard ones out of the way first. So after installing the knuckle, the rotor, and the caliper all the same way it was removed, it's time to move on to those fronts. Oh yeah, and here's a shot of those extended studs saying hello, and this honestly does make wheel installation way easier. Once the car is on the ground, please don't forget to torque your axle nut. This is very important. I'm using aftermarket axles, but the torque specs for the OEM axles and the front spindles are on screen right now. Moving on, the fronts are a somewhat similar process, except you don't need a freezer or a slide hammer, but you'll still need that stucco patch. Remove the brake caliper, brake rotor, and admire this little baby hub flange that looks like it would lose a fight to a saltine cracker. To remove the center cap, just punch a thin tool like a chisel, flathead, or pry bar, and work at different angles to extract it evenly. Next, use a punch to pop up the little divot in the nut and remove it. And you don't need to loosen these before jacking the car up since they don't rotate. Now this might just be a California thing, but the hub just slid right off by hand. If yours is stuck, you might need that slide hammer after all. Now you just need to clean, inspect, and re-grease the spindle, and the new hub just slides right on. Pay close attention when retorquing the axle nut, because if you overdo it, the hub will be difficult to spin, and the last thing a Miata needs is additional rolling resistance. You should be able to feel a little bit of resistance, but still easily spin it by hand. Now punch a new divot into the axle nut. This makes sure it doesn't come loose so you don't lose your wheel. And man, these things look so good, it's honestly a shame they get completely covered up. But we must press on. Go ahead and hammer that center cap back into place, and you're ready to install everything in the reverse order. Now, a lot of people ask me how long certain jobs take, and I never really have a good answer, because when filming an installation video, they could take 3, 4, 5 times longer than it would if I was just trying to hammer the job out. But for an install like this, since there are 2 of each part, I decided to time myself on the other side of the car to give you a good idea of what to expect. I took a picture with my phone of each wheel before starting the job, and then took a picture of the wheel once it was reinstalled on the new hub, and I checked the timestamps in my phone. The front hub, to no surprise, was done in just 10 minutes. This is something you could absolutely do trackside if you lose a front wheel bearing, which you should consider a wear item if you track a lot, and these hubs are so affordable that it kind of makes sense just to keep a spare set on hand. The rear obviously took much longer with the bearing removal and replacement, but I was still able to knock it out in just 59 minutes. That means, even if you're installing bearings like Thor himself, you could knock this job out in under 3 hours in your driveway. So, what are you waiting for?
Alright guys, well that is the overview and installation of the brand new SuperMiata competition hubs. You guys can copy these things at 949racing.com. I'll have them linked in the description below in case you want to get a set for yourself. I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope you learned something, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace out.